You had a lot of experience being in Yemen and seeing the humanitarian crisis there, and there was also a report last Friday describing Yemen as the worst humanitarian crisis in the world currently. And I was just wondering if you could draw on some of your personal experience to describe to me what, how all the different disasters there have culminated to what has become this humanitarian crisis.
Sure. So, over 5 years of conflict have left Yemen decimated. The economy is in crisis. 1.7 million children have been forced to flee their homes from fighting. There's water unavailable in a very water scarce country. Already systems that provided water are now even weaker. The health system is on the brink of collapse, with health workers not having been paid in over 3 years. So this was already a catastrophe for communities living in Yemen. And now we have a new emergency layered over that with the rapid spread of COVID-19. So what we're really facing there is a horrific situation for children.
Yeah. And you mentioned the work that UNICEF has done so far. We're trying to work with the problems that are already happening and then now the onset of COVID-19. So what is the UNICEF currently doing to actively sort of find a solution or help the children?
Sure. So UNICEF, it's our biggest humanitarian response program in the world in Yemen, and we're really trying to keep systems from entirely collapsing. So our programs focus on keeping the health system running, mobilizing health teams that can travel to communities who can't access health centres. We're trying to keep education services open for kids, although school is closed right now because of COVID-19. We're trying to make sure there are opportunities for children to keep learning. We are providing water to close to 18 million people and sanitation services. And given that there's a fuel crisis in Yemen, we're really trying to rebuild water systems with solar power to make sure families can access the water that they need. In terms of our COVID-19 response, we're really trying to make sure that the health system has what capacity it can have to respond. And we have this really difficult situation where the public health advice is to wash your hands and to socially distance, but that becomes really difficult for families who don't have access to clean water and soap. So we're really trying to make sure that those families, particularly ones who were displaced and living in displacement camps, have that sort of supplies that they need to be able to protect themselves.
Is there a solution? And if so, how do we need to look to governments for more economic funding? Do we need to look to the public for more donations? What are your thoughts on that?
Sure. So children and their families in Yemen need two things. In the longer term, they need a sustainable solution to peace. So we need every country in the world, all of the global community, to make sure that we continue to advocate for a peaceful solution to the war in Yemen, and making sure that the experiences of children are given the attention that they deserve. While that takes place, we need to be able to keep providing them with the life-saving assistance that's keeping them alive. And for that, we need funding. And currently our program in Yemen is facing a huge funding crisis where, heartbreakingly, we may have to turn off water to 3 million children if we don't receive the funding that we need by the end of July. By the end of August, if we don't receive funding, critical health services and nutrition services will be cut off to families in need. And so what's left is a perfect storm where you have a pandemic, also epidemics of cholera and outbreaks of vaccine-preventable diseases, but now a funding crisis where we can't provide the services that we know are keeping people alive.
Gosh, that sounds so horrific. And I suppose the issue is, in terms of, for example, Australia, we're already in an economic recession, so it's so hard for the public to demand the leaders to provide assistance to other countries when, in their eyes, it's kind of our country is also in recession. Obviously not, we're not facing a crisis to the extent that Yemen is. But do you have any advice on how the public can approach our leaders or what we can do to act?
Yemen has long been a forgotten war. People really haven't acknowledged the gravity of the situation there for many, many years. But we all have a responsibility too. I know everyone is facing chaos and crisis in their own countries right now, but the scale of suffering there needs the world to pay attention. So for people to engage with the situation there, despite the fact that they have a lot going on in their own lives, dealing with their own crises, is really important to educate themselves about the situation. And children have nothing to do with this war that's fought by adults. And I think any parent or anyone that has a family should care about the suffering of children in anywhere around the world. So despite the fact that our attention also needs to focus on recovery in our own countries, really we need to provide this assistance to the most vulnerable children in the world, and that's really the children in Yemen.
You having been in Yemen personally, if there's one thing that you could tell Australians about what Yemen is or who the children are, and if there's just anything that you wanted to say about your experience, positive or negative, was there anything?
Sure. There are so many people I've met in Yemen that are incredibly courageous and resilient in the face of what is the most horrific humanitarian context that I've ever worked in. And there's always a lot of people that remain in your heart, whether you're in the country or not. And as an Australian, there's one particular story that sticks with me, and that's the story of a young girl who was 12 years old, and like every Aussie, she loved to play sport, she loved to run around, and she lost her leg in an attack back in August last year. And despite the suffering she'd gone through, UNICEF and our partners were able to provide her with a new prosthetic so that she could go out and play sport with her friends, which as an Australian, we all know the joy that brings. And she actually has to have her leg replaced every 3 months because she's running around and using it all the time. So that despite there is this horrific war going on and so much suffering, there really is hope that if we can invest in children in Yemen, they have the energy and the spirit that will really be able to provide, I think, a more prosperous future for the country. But to do that, we need the world to understand what their stories are. And I hope that through doing this sort of work and through raising the profile of the situation there, even though it's in a country that's very far away from Australia, we're able to improve the lives and provide these children with what they so fundamentally deserve, and that will mean that Yemen can look to a much brighter future.